Welcome to the Production Talk podcast with me, Jan of mixartist.com.au. In this podcast series, we celebrate the modern way of producing music. We want to talk about all things related to songwriting, recording at home, and music production. So if you produce your music at home, this is the place to be. Please subscribe and recommend this podcast to all your friends. This is the Production Talk podcast, episode 50. Welcome back to another episode of the Production Talk podcast. At the beginning of this episode, as always, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the country that this following interview is recorded on, the proud Arakwal people of the Bundjalung Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging. And on the same note, I would also like to point out that NIDOC Week is coming up. It's a week where we traditionally celebrate the achievements of our indigenous population. And I would like to invite everybody to tune into especially music from indigenous artists over the next couple of weeks. But let's move on to today's episode. With me is Mr. Andy Hagerman of AVID. Welcome to the podcast, Andy.
Hello, hello.
It is great to have you on board. Last week, I had an amazing interview with a very creative person, with Paulie B, and we ended up towards the end of the episode talking about some technical stuff, and I was just dying to jump in and throw some technical stuff towards the listener. But then I noticed that it really wasn't about me, but more about Paulie. And I also know that I'm really bad at explaining things in simple terms. I really like to drift into really complex things very quickly. So, Andy, I know that you are a genius at phrasing difficult content in words so that even my grandma would understand. And
I'm pretty sure you're exaggerating and completely wrong. But let's go with your endorsement, even though everybody will soon realize that you're completely wrong.
Okay. Fantastic. Look, Andy, first and foremost, you are in Tokyo, Japan. Is that right?
I am in Tokyo, Japan, which has the distinction this week of being 4 or 5 inches away from the surface of the sun. It is so hot here. It's unbelievable. My electric bill is going to be as big as some GDPs of nations. It is just so stinking hot. Yes, crazy. I'm in Japan, and I've lived here for 17 years.
For 17 years. Well, it is winter in Australia, and it's way too cold for my liking. It's only 17 degrees. It's almost freezing for my liking. So send us some warmth our way.
It's hitting 40 in some places 40. Up here.
Oh, I love that.
Nuts.
Look,
completely nuts.
I'm a sucker for the Australian summer. It's never too hot for me. 40 degrees is right on my alley. But
tell you what. Get in a plane. I will too. I'll go to your house. You go to mine. Let's stay there for the next month.
House swap. Yeah, good idea. Andy, you are you are an American citizen, aren't you not? Or do I remember correctly? Yep. Yes. So
I'm like what I call a recovering American.
A recovering American. Well, it's today. Today is the 4th of July. So happy Independence Day to you.
It is the 4th of July. You know, I've missed out. I mean, I live in Japan, obviously. Yeah. I've lived here forever. I've just lost track with all the American holidays. I have people go, "Oh, happy Thanksgiving." I'm like, what now? So 4th of July. I just noticed, as you said it, I'm just looking up there, and it is July 4th. Yeah. And there we go.
Cool.
And I'm working.
Look, Andy, would you mind to share some background about yourself, your professional career, what you are currently doing at AVID, and where you're coming from?
Sure. So I'm a man of a certain age, and that's important to me professionally because I was coming up to where Jan is before people had computers, right? Before DAWs were even around, and when you could still buy tape, right? So the beginning of my life was as a performing musician and as a composer, and still is. And when the technological revolution started coming into vogue in 1983 onward, I was in college, so I had the opportunity to kind of pick up the technology as it was being developed, right? So there was no books, there was no classes, forget about it. But there was, in my college at Northwestern, there was just a real enthusiastic small bunch of geeks who just kind of ate up the next thing, DATs, ADATs, SPDIF, whenever it came out, we're like all over it.
Yeah.
And MIDI, the whole 9 yards. And so I kind of self-taught myself. Is that the right way to say it? I guess not.
Yeah.
I was self-taught. There we go. I was self-taught in the ways of how the music technology could let me do the things that I couldn't do well, but better. Like, so I'm a good composer, I think, but I'm a terrible keyboard player. And MIDI just swooped in and saved me for the only reason that you could play it slow when you're recording and then speed it up later. That's all I needed. That's all I needed. I have terrible handwriting. And so Sibelius and Finale and all those other applications, they came in. So I've always kind of been the guy who I don't really care about technology except for how it helps me be creative.
Yeah.
Right. So the DSP chips on an HDX card and what I've got on the Apollo Twin and the all that stuff could not possibly care less, up to the point where it helps me to get what I have in my mind out of the speakers. And that's what I still do. And right now, so you asked me professionally, I'm now in charge of, and have been for a long time, in charge of the audio curriculum for AVID, so that they're the company that makes Pro Tools, and so all the Pro Tools books, all the Sibelius books, the Venue books to a certain degree, I coordinate that curriculum and certification and all that stuff, and I'm also writing some of those books. I just got done writing the new Pro Tools 101 book, and I'm working on the Pro Tools 110 book, which explains why I have no hair. Which you can't see because it's an audio podcast, but trust me, I'm as bald as a cue ball.
Yeah, well, your impressive beard makes up for everything.
I do. It's like all my hair fell off my head and just kind of landed on my chin.
Classic. And do you find enough time to be a musician these days, or is it all just work for?
Boy, I tell you, it's tough because when I was before Corona, I was traveling so much that you can't really join a band, right? And because writing a book, anybody who hasn't written a book thinks, oh, I know all this stuff. It'll take about a weekend. Anybody who has written a book knows that it is tremendously time intensive, and you have to shut out the world, and it's just a hard slog. Yeah. And so taking on these book projects has been great, but I really, the most creative stuff I've done is playing bass and creating stuff for the exercises in the book. And I actually did one big band chart that I'm super proud of. But the inspiration of it was to do an exercise for the book. It just happened to be good. But when I get done with this book, and normally I usually like to keep a good project going, kind of in the background. So anybody who needs a Pro Tools or a musician guy, that's Andyman at jcom.ne.jp.
Okay, cool.
Contact me. I've got reasonable rates.
Look, put that into the chat, then from there I can copy it into the show notes, so everybody can just finish this episode, head over to the show notes, and click a link to find Andy.
Shameless self-promotion.
Yeah. Look, I would like to first go through a couple of standard, myths and misunderstandings, maybe, just a couple of subjects that I come up against again and again and again. And I thought, being the official Pro Tools educator of the world, you're probably the best person to answer this for good for us. So a question that I've come across a couple of times is that when people record at home and then switch between DAWs from one to the other, so you might want to start recording your guitar into DAW-A and then switch to DAW-B. Is the sound file recorded any different? Is there any difference in tonal quality?
From the sound file's perspective, absolutely not. It can't change, right?
Mm-hmm. Please expand on this. Why is that?
Because because if it were to change, so you record a sound file. Mm-hmm. You record a sound file into, let's say, Logic. Let's put a name to it. Okay, yep. You record it into Logic. It sounds great, right? And that sound file is a sequence of ones and zeros. Now, anybody who's ever messed around with the deep data of files knows that changing a 1 to a 0 or a 0 to a 1 more often than not results in a invalid file. Right. So usually any subtle change won't make it sound different. It'll just make it corrupt. Right.
Yep.
So that file is a sequence of ones and zeros. You move that file onto another computer. Does it change size? No. Does it change the orders of the ones and zeros? No. So the file itself is completely unaltered. It has to be. If it was any other way, then digital technology beyond audio wouldn't work. This stream wouldn't work. Word documents wouldn't work. All things.
Okay.
Now, if it sounds different to you, which is what people are saying, is like, it sounds different to me. That's a function of a lot of different things. That can be a function of the mix engine of the DAW. That can be the function of and this is something a lot of people overlook, the components in your interface, specifically the clock.
Yeah.
The clock is a tiny little, ugly little chip that's on the board controlling the timing of the samples. Right. And it sounds like that's a nothing job, but it is possibly the most important job of any interface. And people will go, well, my stereo image just sounds like it's not as wide. Well, that is the clock. That's the clock having jitter. And so can a file sound different on different systems? Oh, absolutely. But is the file changing? No, it's not.
Okay. So if I left, let's say, the microphone unchanged, my preamp unchanged, the audio interface is the same, but I just switched from the first DAW to another one, the actual file recorded wouldn't differ at all. Good.
Wouldn't differ at all. At that point, if you're dealing with the same system and the only thing you've changed, it is the mix engine of the DAW, which I'm guessing is the question you'll be asking me next.
We'll get to that a little bit later, if I may.
Okay.
But so the mix engine is basically affecting a sound only after it's recorded. So it might affect what we hear, but not actually how the file stored to the hard drive is sounding. Yeah, got it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And that's just something that a lot of people overlook when they're recording is when you record, it's basically going from the interface to your hard drive.
Yes.
Right. It's not going really through your DAW. It's your DAW is kind of managing the job of the interface, but it's not, it's not affecting anything. So if you bring down the level or you play around with the level on a track that's recording, or if you put a plug-in on there, it doesn't affect that at all. So really, it's the interface that controls that that file going to the hard drive. When you listen to things, you're listening back through the DAW, and that's where the changes between DAWs can come into play.
Good. All right. The reason why I asked this question is that I once attended a master class where somebody who I shall not name just told me that, he did exactly that, switch between two DAWs, and immediately felt like one sounded significantly better than the other. And I was scratching my head. Well,
no, he's completely right but not because the file changed. It's because the engine that's playing it back changed. Think of it this way.
Okay.
You've got a brand new record.
Yep.
Right? You put it on turntable A. And then the whole system stays the same, right? But you replace the turntable with another turntable. Could it sound different? Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely it could.
Makes perfect sense. But the record is the same. Yeah.
But the record's the same.
Okay. Look, what made me a bit suspicious is that the next thing that person who I shall not name said is that, he then decided to, drive the preamps nicely into clipping for the beautiful analog warmth that he got. What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, if you're dealing with a seminar from somebody who shall not be named, I don't think that Voldemort should be giving seminars. Okay, I'm just saying, right? I'm going to name him Voldemort. We all know he who shall not be named. His name so Voldy, I'm throwing you under the bus. So there's a difference between saturation and clipping.
Okay.
Okay, and so. Do you mind if I go down this rabbit hole?
Yes, for a little while.
Okay,
Please.
I'm going to go down this rabbit hole. Let's help briefly. So, when you're dealing with tape, when you're recording to tape, tape is magnetic particles that are being realigned, right? So it has a noise floor that that digital doesn't have to that degree. So you want to make sure your signals are loud enough so it kind of hits this magnetic tape sweet spot where it's fairly transparent. It doesn't sound any different really. It's as accurate as tape can be, right? And then what you do is you push it just a little bit, and what happens is the magnetic tape, like a sponge, cannot absorb any more signal. It does what a sponge does when it can't absorb more water. It is saturated, right? Yeah. It's not distorted. It's just going to ignore. It can't store that additional stuff, right? Now, digital, and by the way, when we have saturation, that can give us that warmth. It does things psychoacoustically that we super, super love, right? And that's something that people will point to, and they'll say analog's better because of that over anything else, right? And then you go to digital. Now, digital is painfully honest, right? Now, it doesn't have a lot of noise floor. It has a very, very small 1-bit noise floor, which if you're recording at 24-bit is way below what you can hear. And it tends to be very accurate and get more accurate the more bits you use, right? Up to a certain degree. I mean, you don't have to record as hot as possible without clipping all the time, but it's very clear. It's very neutral. It sounds exactly like what, or as close to exactly as we can with the technology we have now. It sounds like what you put into it until you give it too much data. And when you give it too much data, it doesn't saturate, it rejects, right? It's like, okay, I can go up to -0 dB. If you give me too much, I'm going to stay at -0 dB and go F yourself. And what you're going to get is it's going to do what we call clipping. And clipping basically is a straight line from one sample to another at the highest amplitude. Yes. And what that does is it says speaker push out and stay pushed out, which is not good for your speakers. And it doesn't have that it's not going to give you a saturation kind of feel. Now, a lot of people use clipping and saturation interchangeable. And so maybe that's what this Voldemort person did. Maybe what he did is he saturated it and he liked the sound of it. But generally speaking, when you actually digitally clip, it's not a sound that people generally go for in terms of warmth and fullness.
Okay, good. Thank you very much for that. I'm definitely on board with staying away from digital clipping. There's very few situations in which I find that could be useful.
There's facts like Trent Reznor makes very good use of it intentionally, right?
Yeah. Yes, intentionally. Yes, that's a good point. But you're right. He probably doesn't try it once and that's it. He probably tries several times and pushes a bit more, a bit less until it sits just right. So it's very intentional, as you said. Yes, good. All right, the next question that I have for you. Let me just assume that we have a very consistent player. Let's say a really good keyboard player who plays pads and they come in at pretty much the exact same volume. And now, instead of exchanging a DAW, we stay with the same one, but we exchange audio interfaces. So that's the only variable here. No? Will the recording level in our DAW be always the same?
The recording level isn't in your DAW. The recording level is never in your DAW. The recording level is always in your interface. So this is the thing, is that when you've got so I'm going to use Pro Tools as an example. I'm not trying to sell it. I'm just going to use it as an example. But if you hit the record button on a track, the little fader thing turns red. That indicates that that's a recording track. That fader, however, is not changing the level of the signal that is going to disc. True. That is changing the level of the signal that's going out the speakers that you're listening to. So if you see your meters, which are giving you an indication of what's coming in, if they're clipping and you bring down that fader on the recording track, you've done absolutely nothing of value, right? Okay. You've made it softer coming out of your speakers, but it's still clipping going into the hard drive, which is what you don't want. Yep. So, or you said keyboard player, so right, it's a line level signal, right? So
exactly, I was just about to say, let's say we have a line level signal going into different interfaces, all at line level. And
right. Well, then turn down the keyboard.
Yeah, good point. But let's say if the keyboard player was giving us a healthy level, and I just exchanged, let's say, from an AVID interface to an Apogee to, I don't know, Yamaha or what have you.
Sure.
Would the level that we see visually in our DAW or meter in our DAW, would that always be the same?
Probably not.
Can you expand on this? Because, I've come across people teaching religiously that, a certain analog level equals a certain digital level. But my understanding is also that that's not a given.
Well, keep in mind that your interfaces are always interpreting a signal coming in, an electrically variable signal. So basically, the signal coming on the line level input is neither analog or digital. It's a stream of electrons, right? And what happens is your audio interface takes a look at that and is going to then convert that to ones and zeros. Now, that's subject to a lot of different things, right? And again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but your clock, which controls the accuracy of the timing of samples being output, is also controlling the accuracy of samples going in, right?
Yes.
So when you record on another interface, could that jitter affect the stereo image of your sound? Yes, it could. And can a narrower stereo image sound louder? Yes, it can. Right? We're talking about very small amounts of volume change, but the tonal change can be significant.
Okay.
Which is why, and you forgive me for preaching a little bit here, but
go for it.
If there's one place you don't want to scrimp, it's the audio interface, because you can have a great microphone, you can have all the best stuff, you can have great speakers and all that stuff, but if the stuff getting into your system isn't the best you can possibly get, that's a weak link that you can't afford to have.
Okay. Let me just expand a bit on this question. So some people say that, a negative 18 dBFS is the reference level. Now this term of a reference level is something that I come across occasionally, and I guess that relates to line level, being traditionally plus 4 dBu. We're getting technical here.
And do it.
I found that, when you, let's say, change from, let's say, an AVID interface, which is traditionally, the HDIOs, I believe, are calibrated to negative 18 dBFS if you feed it plus 4 dBu. Yep. And that could be something else on another interface. So I've now found some Apogees that are then shifted by 2 dBs to negative 16. Is this something that you've come across?
So that might, I think we're shifting specifications.
Okay.
So when we talk about minus 18, sometimes minus 20, sometimes minus 16, it varies by region. And what you're talking about are your loudness targets, right? So your the way that you monitor, that's really what those affect more than anything else. When you record, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you've got nice hot levels with enough headroom that you're not clipping, and you're done. You're done. There's no target. There's no target recording level like there was with analog, and I'll tell you why there was with analog in just a second. But there isn't in digital, simply because there's no specific nonlinearity here, right? So when we talk about the loudness levels, minus 18, you're talking about speaker calibration, right? Not recording. You're talking about speaker calibration, and so those speaker calibrations, those are how you should set your system up so that you know that the levels that you're hearing are going to translate. But when you're recording, if I record a track that's 10 dB, that's peaking at around minus 10 dB, am I completely fine? Completely. Am I going to bring the level down? Absolutely not, right? Because you bring the level down, it's going to bring up whatever ambient noise floor, right? In terms of a percentage. Yeah. Now somebody might say, oh, great. I get what Andy's saying. I'm going to record always as hot as possible without clipping. Mathematically, by the way, back in the old days of only 16-bit audio, we used to have to do that because the dynamic range of 16-bit audio was less than the dynamic range of the human being. However, if you record it, I'm sorry, I'm getting really technical. If you record it 24-bit, your dynamic range from top to bottom is 144 dB. Your dynamic range as a human being is only 120. So you've got plenty of headroom to play with, right? So you could completely have a track that is peaking at minus 10, minus 6, minus 5, minus whatever, and you're not going to lose any significant quality. But I don't want you to go around thinking, oh, now I have to change my level down to minus 18. That is not how recording workflows happen.
Yeah.
Now, however, that used to be that used to have more of a place when it came to analog, because when you're dealing with faders and we're dealing with an analog console, each fader is essentially an amplifier, right? And analog amplifiers, have what's called nonlinearity. They will distort, right? And all amplifiers have a degree of nonlinearity. And so what people used to do is they used to try to keep their recording levels to the point where their faders didn't have to move too much. And so what that would do is that would keep the nonlinearity from the faders from being too much of an issue, right? It's a version of gain staging, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And so people used to do that because of the nonlinearities that are introduced when you move a fader around. Now in Pro Tools or in any DAW, when you move the faders inside of Pro Tools, you are not introducing nonlinearity in the same way because it's not an analog system.
Well said. Well said. Wow. I've done some episodes on similar subjects before. I might just throw a couple of links into the show notes as well if anybody wants to know more about those things. There's one thing that I want to go in or ask a couple more questions about. You just mentioned 16 and 24-bit, and we all know this. Sure. When we create a new project, hopefully we make a decision right at the beginning to either record 16 or 24. So am I correct in saying that 16-bit is not your choice, you choose 24?
That's correct.
Yeah.
So you want the most data, you want the most relevant data that you can possibly get.
Yeah.
Now, my dynamic range and yours is about 120 dB at our prime, right? And I'm not at my prime, and you still are, Jan. So you're probably able to tolerate a higher dynamic range than I can as an old guy. That's fine, right? Neither one of us can tolerate much more than 120 dB. That becomes the threshold of pain, right? Now, when you're recording at 16-bit, then first of all, let me back up. What's a good dynamic range for recording to tape, do you think?
I think tape had about 60 dBs, if I remember correctly.
60 or 70. Yeah. And by the way, that would change during the day. That's why we had those degaussers, right? Remember, we used to have to maintain those things at least in the morning, right? But on a great day, it would have maybe 60 or 70 dB of dynamic range. And so that's roughly half of your dynamic range. So the noise floor was absolutely audible. Right. Yes, and we had to do a lot of things. Yes. And that's why we made sure that we recorded fairly loud, generally speaking, so that we would basically mask the noise of the tape.
That's right.
Now that largely doesn't exist on a digital system. And if you're getting a lot of hiss and noise, it's probably your wires are next to AC or something like that.
That's right. Yep, that's right. That's exactly what we discussed last week with Paulie B, and he basically mentioned that digital doesn't have a noise floor anymore. Although
it does have a noise floor.
It is there, but it's so quiet that if gain staged correctly, it's irrelevant. Is that a fair statement?
Well, not exactly. Gain staging is I think, something that's misapplied. But let's stay with the noise floor.
Yeah, okay.
So the built-in noise floor of digital audio is the least significant bit. Right, so it's the 16th bit of 16-bit audio. It's the 24th bit of 24-bit audio. Now, here's the thing: that 16th bit of 16-bit audio is minus 96 dB, which is a lot better than tape was, right? And it's not a hiss; it's just a little tiny bit of distortion. It's rounding error essentially. When you're recording at 24-bit, that's at minus 144 dB. So it's if you're recording at a decent level, you'll never hear that.
Exactly.
It's just that becomes a non-issue in terms of the DAW.
That's right.
So I would now here's the other thing. Here's where you might go next, and maybe I'm preempting your next question. Where does 32-bit floating point audio fit into this? Right. And here's the thing to remember is that 32-bit audio. I'm going to say this right. 32-bit audio is 24-bit audio with a wrapper.
That's right.
So 32-bit audio is a 24-bit what's called a mantissa, right? That's the raw data. And that's really what's being captured by the audio interface. And what's wrapped around it is a thing called an exponent, which allows you to shift the audio up or down depending upon whether or not it's going to be clipping. 32-bit audio is tremendously useful in DAW mixing. And that's why it's built into most DAWs, Pro Tools being one of them.
Is it correct to say that today most audio interfaces actually have 24-bit converters? 32-bit converters are sort of on the horizon. Some manufacturers have them, but they're not a standard yet. So recording... sorry, please go for it.
Go ahead. Please.
So recording, let's say, 32-bit audio files with a 24-bit converter, we could argue that there's not much to be gained here. Is that correct?
No, we could state that there's nothing to be gained there.
Okay. Yeah, cool. All right. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So, because you still get all the benefit of floating point inside the DAW. So you could record and create a 32-bit floating point word, but you're not gaining anything, and you're arguably wasting space, right? Because the file's going to be bigger. And I would say that keeping in mind that 32-bit audio has a 24-bit mantissa, I would say that any interface that purports to have 32-bit floating point recording is not giving you the value you think it's giving you. Because the interface has to create that 24-bit word first. And that's the data we really care about. Right.
Okay.
So
Got it.
With the technology we have right now, and I want, could things change? Sure, certainly. Hopefully they will. They certainly will, right?
Yeah.
But with the technology that we have today, recording at 24-bit, first of all, is completely adequate. It's more dynamic range than we need. And then you take advantage of what floating point gives you where you really need it. And that's in the DAW.
Okay, good. All right. So let me just sum this up, and please interrupt if I get this wrong. But, most of our converters, input and output converters, are 24-bit. But what happens in between, let's say in our DAW, when we move a fader or a pan port or add a compressor, that's done at a higher bit resolution, being 32-bit float or occasionally 64-bit float, depending on the tool. But it's always only ever in between those two converters. So the converters are, I'm not sure if I could call it a bottleneck at 144 dB, but there's more dynamic range to be had inside the DAW. Am I on the right track here?
Yeah, and at this point, I have to talk about Pro Tools specifically because it's the DAW. I'm not trying to sell it. But this is the DAW I know. Is inside each individual track, the signal flow in each individual track is 32-bit floating point, and that's 32-bit floating point between each one of the inserts, your plugins, all that stuff, the faders, the whole 9 yards, right? That whole signal track or signal flow in an audio track, aux track, whatever, is 32-bit floating point, which means it's going to be extremely difficult to clip. And if you do clip, like you clip on the input of a plugin or whatever, you can recover from that easily with the gain input or the gain from the plugin, and there's no permanent damage done, which is not what it would be like with fixed point or with tape, frankly.
Okay, so what you're saying is that once we're in floating point, we actually have numbers above zero in the digital domain.
I don't think I've ever said it that way, but basically what the exponent does is it steps in when needed to raise the mantissa and extend our headroom when needed, right?
Yes.
And
yes.
So I would say that yes, it shifts that dynamic range up when it's needed. But usually it's not needed at all, right? But when it is needed, then it steps in, which can give you a lot more clarity than people would normally have. Okay. Now, 32-bit floating point, AVID determined, and I agree, was not sufficient when you're combining large numbers of tracks. So each track, again, has 32-bit floating point in its own signal flow on each track. When the track's output goes to the mix engine, that mix engine is 64-bit floating point, which is a redonkulous amount of headroom, right? And again, you can go extremely hard with a large number of tracks. You just bring that master fader down, boom, you're done.
Okay.
And there's no coloring. There's no, people talk about not touching the master fader. That not touching the master fader is an analog console rule. It is not a digital DAW rule. Now,
couldn't agree more. Yes.
And I'll say this in closing: not all DAWs are built the same when it comes to the mix engine.
Yes,
and that's why people choose one DAW over the other. So when I'm talking about how Pro Tools does it, not all DAWs have the same robustness.
Yes. Got it. Okay, so you just mentioned the summing engine. So if I, let's say, now use a send to route, snare to reverb, is that affected as well? If it, then also sums with the toms or other signals?
Say that again. I'm not sure I understand the question.
So does that only affect, my main output, the output that feeds my speakers, or all the buses as well?
Oh, everything. So, anything that's summed together is summed together in Pro Tools. Again, I'm talking about in a 64-bit world where it's very it's very impossible. It's almost impossible to get into unrecoverable trouble.
Got it.
That covers the whole thing.
Wow. Okay. Love it. This is a really good discussion to have. Let's move on from the theory to some more practical examples.
Hit me.
A lot of musicians who start recording themselves often run into one problem called latency, that you play your instrument and then you put your headphones on and you hear yourself later. It sounds like an echo. Can you explain any strategies to deal with that and overcome that? Because that can be a bit of a mood killer when performing.
Oh, it's definitely a mood killer. Oh, it's as a musician myself, it's nigh on impossible to play when latency becomes that much of an issue. So, it's generally speaking a hardware solution, right? Okay. And there's a number of different ways you can do that. So there's so I'm looking on my desk here and I can see my Apollo Twin, which is a fine little interface, right? And one of the things you can do with this fine little interface is you can take the input that you're recording and monitor it from the interface itself, not through the DAW. So you record into the DAW. I almost said Pro Tools. You record into the DAW. The track that you're recording to is muted so that you don't hear that. And then what you're doing is you're monitoring through the interface itself. Now, some interfaces, and this is a relatively new addition, but some interfaces will then allow you to have a little bit of effect. So you want to put some reverb on there and still keep low latency? You can, but you're almost, at that point, you're starting to defeat the feature because once you start putting plugins on there, you're introducing latency again as well inside the interface because there's no free lunch when you get to it. Now, that works great with smaller interfaces, with smaller recording. For you and I doing this podcast is completely fine. When you're recording a symphony orchestra, that breaks down. You can't have a symphony orchestra recording to 52 Apollo Twins. No, it's not going to happen. And that's why people will at some point go to larger hardware DSP solutions, where there's so much DSP horsepower under the hood in terms of and I'm trying not to sell AVID again, but your HDX cards and those things, those are specifically built with one primary goal over anything else, and that is to get that signal in as quickly as possible and get it right back out to the players. And it really doesn't go to the hard drive. It just it lives on that DSP chip on a card, but that might as well be just another interface. Yeah, it's so close to the input and the output.
Okay, so that's a solution that's suitable for large scale studios, but
sure,
it's really
but
not,
for smaller scale studios, you buy an interface that allows you to monitor through it, which almost all interfaces do.
Yes, okay.
And then if you feel strongly about having reverb on your vocal track when you're recording, which is reasonable, there's ways to work around that as well. But there's almost no free lunch when it comes to smaller situations because you're at the mercy of the USB bus, you're at the mercy of the computer CPU, the RAM, all that stuff, and that's not. There's no DAW that really fixes that without leveraging the hardware. Now there's there's the Pro Tools side. There's also a Universal Audio side, which is their Luna DAW. Do you know what it does? It uses the audio interface, just the same way that Pro Tools uses the HDX cards. So it's not a software solution; it's a hardware solution.
Yes, that's right. So there's limits to what's computers can do. What effect has the DAW's buffer size on latency? Do we need to consider that?
Again, you're asking questions that differ by DAW, and for the most part, a DAW's hardware buffer is the storage place for audio that's coming in, being processed, and then having to go out. Now, the higher your buffer is, the more tasks can be accomplished without overrunning your buffer and causing problems. However, the bigger your buffer, the more time you're giving to your CPU to get those jobs done, right? And so the larger latency between an input time and an output time. So the problem has been that, and the recommendation has always been, is like when you're recording, keep your buffer small so that audio gets into the buffer and gets out of it quickly. Oh, that's great, except for you can't do much with it because your small buffer can't run too many plugins. So when you're done recording, the common wisdom is to then set your buffer to be as large as possible, which is going to give you the maximum amount of time that you're giving your system to do a lot of different, DSP processes.
Got
it. Some DAWs, one DAW, it begins with a P, ends with Pro Tools, has two buffers in it. And this is something a lot of people don't know. There is a buffer for record arm tracks, which you can set low and get low latency, but there's a hidden buffer that's always active on any track that's not recording back, and it's always set high. So you can actually, if you get the right DAW, you can actually get the best of both worlds if there are two hardware buffers. If there's only one hardware buffer, then Jan, you're just right back to where you have to make that decision. When you're recording, set it as low as possible.
Yep.
When you're playing back, set it higher. And you just keep on doing that ping pong, and you'll never get the best of both worlds. But there are some DAWs, there's one, that can give you that dual functionality.
Okay, good. All right, got it. So software monitoring solution via the interface is the best solution in many situations. But the buffer size, playing with the buffer size depending on the DAW, can also have an effect on improving latency.
Yes, yeah.
And I guess, in this case, we need to follow the rule of recording with as few plugins as possible and then adding them later after recording.
That's generally a good rule anytime, right? Because, plugins will always take time, right?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
and the one thing I wouldn't do is I wouldn't record with things like compressors on there. You don't want to record with compressors on there anyways because you want the performer to know what they're doing dynamically. Now, when you record with a reverb, as long as you've got a send going to another reverb, if the reverb is a few samples late, nobody cares, right? It still gives them that nice whooshy sense. So, ambience and delays and all that stuff, have at it, right? Because that's a send going to another track. You don't want to put that reverb or the delay on the track that you're recording on. Please don't do that.
Excellent.
But if you send it to another track, then if it's whatever samples late, nobody's going to complain about that. Nobody will notice.
Okay. Let me change the subject a little. You're a specialist in keyboards and MIDI, you said. I always found that...
I've never said that. You're putting words in my mouth.
Well, at least in comparison to me, definitely.
All right.
I mix mainly audio recordings, and I don't handle MIDI or don't make MIDI music myself. But when I tried, I always struggled to produce a performance that sounded somewhat authentic. It always sounded like, a boring robot. What tips have you got for capturing, really good, emotionally charged, vibey recordings through MIDI?
So, at the risk of sounding overly philosophical,
please go for it.
If you want to make good music with MIDI, study music.
Okay.
The answer to that does not start with mastering MIDI.
Okay.
The answer to that starts with mastering the understanding of instruments and how they work. So let's take an instrument that's hard to get to sound right. Let's take a trumpet. All right. Trumpet. it's usually fairly easy to drop a sample in there and it just goes, right? But that's not the way a trumpet plays. A trumpet plays because he's starting the note and then he can crescendo, he can decrescendo, he can do all these different things. Well, understanding how a trumpet player plays and what he can do with his instrument is the first step, right? And then once you understand and you have a very clear concept of what you want that piece to sound like, then and only then do you go into MIDI and figure out how to make it happen. Now, the temptation is going to be to say, well, MIDI just can't do it. To which I will say, MIDI is doing it every day of your life and you don't even know it. There are MIDI orchestras being played. There are scores, there are jingles, there are song backings that are 100% MIDI and you never knew. Why? Because the technology is there. But it's not the easiest thing. Why is it not the easiest thing? Because it was developed in 1982 and it hasn't been updated since, right? So it's old technology, but it's there. It's there. And so what I would do, there's a couple of MIDI parameters that will get you, after you understand how the part works, that will get you the emotion you're looking for. The first thing is velocity, right? Mm-hmm. So when I want a part to be louder, I don't reach for volume first. I reach for velocity first, because what velocity does is it tells the virtual instrument to strike it harder, right? So let's take a snare drum, for example. You've got a MIDI snare, and that MIDI snare is hitting at, let's say the default velocity of 64, let's say, right? So you're hitting the default. You want that snare to be louder. If you use volume, it's going to be louder in amplitude, but it's going to sound like you turned up the volume on a person playing a snare with medium intensity, right? Okay. Don't do that. Leave your volume where it was. Bring up the velocity, and basically that velocity message says, hit that snare harder, right? Or faster, actually. Hit that snare faster. The volume will change naturally, and the timbre will change as well, because that's what the instrument is designed to do, right? So reach for velocity before you reach for volume. That's the first thing. But then for more involved, complex instruments like trumpet, for example, there are other continuous controllers that will let you contour that sound. The one that is typically used out the gate is controller number 11, which is called expression, which you can think of expression as a volume control under your volume. So in other words, you can then contour the amplitude of the instrument itself before you get to the mixer, right? So you don't have to ride the volume. You don't want to do that at the fader level anyways. But those continuous controllers can change the level of that. Now, if you want to get really, really interesting, you can then say, well, you know what? As the trumpet blows harder, it gets brighter. So what you can do then is you can then ride a low pass filter, right, to get the amplitude to happen. So there's so many things that you can do, and you can do it well, right? But the one thing you don't want to do is you don't want to go, okay, I'm going to use a pencil tool, bump, throw a lot of stuff. Wow, that doesn't sound good. MIDI sucks, and then move on. That's not the journey. That's not the journey you want to take if you're going to be a composer.
That was a really good answer to the question, because that's exactly what I've tried in the past. Especially right cymbals, when placed with a pencil in a piano roll editor, I find them unbearably boring.
Oh, sure.
Okay, really good tips to try.
Definitely breathe life into them. Yep.
Yeah. Okay, excellent. I guess we're already on the subject, so we've spoken about so many technical aspects of recording: latency, fighting the computer, working with your DAW, digital audio theory, and now we're actually there to record a really good take. And chances are, by the time we get to it, we're somewhat far down a technical rabbit hole. How do you manage to switch between being, a creative, a musician, to perform from the bottom of your heart and with full soul, while at the same time managing all these technical things? So, what's your take on this? How do you succeed?
So you're implying that I have succeeded. Thank you. Here's again, I'm going to get overly philosophical. I apologize to everybody who's listening in advance for being preachy. But
please be.
Imagine you are... Oh, I'm going to use trumpet again. I just got trumpet on the brain. You're a trumpet player. You're a 12-year-old kid, right? You're sitting down in your parents' basement because they can't stand to hear you practice the trumpet, right? Because it is awful. It is absolutely awful. You're trying to put air through the instrument. It just sounds like a duck, right? The only way that you can become an instrumentalist with that instrument, for example, is to refine your concept of sound, right? Until you get that sound crystal clear in your head, you'll never get it out of your body, right? But the interesting thing is, once you get your brain programmed to make the sound that you want, your brain is built to take care of all the little parts of your body that make it work. So it's just astonishing that people will be like, I don't get it. This is what I want to sound like. I don't get it. This is what I want to sound like. And all of a sudden they'll go, boom, and automatically when they stop worrying about, all the muscles in their lungs and am I taking a full breath, at that point they finally actualize and they're the trumpet player they always wanted to be, right? That is the technology of being a trumpet player, and they've mastered it, which allows them to move on and not think about it anymore because it's no longer consuming them. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Now,
that's fantastic, Andy. Keep going.
A DAW is a trumpet.
Okay.
A DAW Explain. Can do the problem with music technology is it's too easy to make garbage, right? And so people will go in, they'll dip. Oh, this is awful. I'm not a creative person. They get frustrated and they quit, right? Thinking that because they're making music that's not good, but it sounds, the fidelity is great. It's just, it has no soul in it. And they get frustrated because they feel like somehow they're missing something. Here's what you're missing: the concept of what you wanted. You're missing the 100 hours in the practice room to try to figure out how this trumpet works. You need to spend, here's what you need to do. You need to spend time understanding the fundamental technology of how digital audio works. Is it boring? Yes, it is. Okay. If you have a hard time sleeping, here's a book I want you to buy. Ken Pohlmann, Pohlmann. The book is called Principles of Digital Audio. It is the deepest technical book on digital audio on the planet. But once you get through it, you understand how those ones and zeros work. And you know what? Once you understand how they work, you can forget about it. It becomes something you know and no longer stress over. Understand how the components of your interface work. Understand jitter. We've talked about jitter. Most people don't know what it is. Learn what it is. Learn what a picosecond is. Until you know what a picosecond is, you don't know how jitter works, right? Then once you study these technical terms, put them in the proper perspective, which is way, way, way back in the back of your mind. You can call on them anytime you want, but that's not what you should be thinking about when you sit behind the instrument and try to be creative. That's half of your study. The other half of your study is to go to as many concerts, go to as many bars, go to meet as many musicians as you possibly can. You know what? Go to a bar. Go to the bar that, I know there's probably people that are 60 years old. When it's legal, go to a bar and buy the band drinks and say, hey, listen, I'm studying music. Tell me how that bass works. What are you doing? Can I hold it? And they'll probably say no, but just show me how your hand works. Show me where your fingers are. If you move your fingers over here, what does it do? If you move your fingers over here, what does it do? And they'll be more than happy to show you because that's their study. That's what they've learned to do. And you don't have to be a great bass player, but you have to understand how those instrument works because you've got the power to recreate it in a DAW, but you can't recreate it if you don't know what to recreate. And if you can't recreate, then you can't create.
That makes so much sense, Andy. Thank you. That's phenomenal stuff. Wow, that's eye-opening. I love talking about musical philosophy, so that's really good. Have you got any other nuggets of wisdom that you would like to share on capturing performance and getting the heart and soul out of the music?
Well, so there's capturing or creating the performance yourself, right? And then there's the recording engineer's job. Let's say I'm a recording engineer that I'm recording other people. I've got clients in the room. At that point, obviously, your understanding of the musical genre, I think, becomes important. But the understanding of how to play a bass is not, because there's somebody playing bass, right? So I'm speaking, when you study the instruments, that's more of a compositional approach, right? Which is tremendously valuable for a composer. But if you just want to be if you want to be a recording engineer, I don't want to be just a recording engineer, but if you want to be the best recording engineer, understand the genre, understand what they're looking for. But the other thing that your job is to do is to create an atmosphere in the room that is completely relaxed, right? and one thing, and by the way, you can't keep the drummer from hating the guitar player. Okay, that kind of stress, that's not something you can control. But what you can control is, somebody goes, okay, so we got that take done. Can we do the next take? Yeah, hold on a second. I need to create a new session, then I need to create new tracks. And 10 minutes later, you're ready to go. You can't do that. You can't do that. You have to learn the tools that allow you to manage a recording session very quickly. And they're out there, right?
Quickly, yeah.
But your goal is that you have such a control over your recording devices and your instrument, which is your recording, that what you do is quick, accurate, and effortless.
Yes. Wow. Well, that's really good stuff, Andy. So it all comes down to really good and fast workflows. So it's really not about... Please keep going.
But the fast workflows don't come without a concept of what your goal is. And I think that that's what a lot of people don't do right? And by the way, manufacturers don't help you. Manufacturers will come up and say, hey, we have the best workflows. Oh, great, that's it. Can you tell me? No, we have the greatest workflows. Look at Skywalker Sound's doing it. And that doesn't necessarily help people who are starting out. What does help people starting out is knowing what they want to achieve artistically or technologically, and then digging and finding people who can like yourselves, right? Like you, who can, strip away all of the marketing hype and the hyper high technology part of it to a more relevant stuff. Like I said, I care about technology to the degree that it helps me be creative. Beyond that, I do not care. I understand a lot of it because it's the job I'm in, but I don't care about it.
Well said. Wow, this is really excellent stuff. As we sort of approach the end of it, if I may just change the subject entirely, one of the other biggest problems musicians face these days is monetizing their music. Have you got any tips, or have you come across anybody who shared some interesting secrets with you of how one could approach making money with music today?
I hate to tell you that I don't have an answer to that question. My blessing and my curse are my age. It was a blessing because, I came up back in the days when if you really wanted a band, you hired a band, right? And live music, I think, had a bigger prominence on the stage, and of course the fact that people were making records and CDs back in the day. Those are things you actually had to buy, and when you have to buy things like that, buy physical things, that that's why making a record can give you that house, right? Yep. Remember back in the days, people were saying, let's make a record, and what we make out of this record, I can buy a boat, right? Now people make a record, out of the money I can make from this record, I can buy a sandwich, right? It's the devaluation of art is a cultural issue, and if there's a solution for it, I'm not aware of it. The only thing that I will say is this, as far as monetizing, is that the source of what people pay is what you want to go after, right? So composing for artists has been fairly lucrative for me. Recording songs and doing stuff on my own has not been something I've even pursued because I know there's just no money in it. But when there's there's a famous musician or somebody that wants to get something and they've got a budget for it. Now that budget's smaller than it used to be, but it is a budget, right? It's in the thousands. at that point, they're going to me for skills that I've taken the time to develop that nobody else, that few other people have, right? Okay. So I've made myself valuable in that sense. Mm-hmm. If you're an extremely gifted performer, you're valuable in another sense, and people will hire you for their sessions. People will hire for their lives, but you've got to be exceptional. And I know that's not great news, but it's also not a change, right? When I went to college back in the 1980s, less than 3% of all the people that went in at my school of music, which was one of the best in the country, less than 3% were still in the business 5 years after they graduated. So it's always been hyper competitive, right? Yes. So it's still hyper competitive. And it's still very, there's a lot of, for every one person that makes it, there's a score of people who haven't. That has always been the case. And if you want to, break out of that, you have to differentiate yourself through quality.
Oh, that's
sorry. It's not a great answer.
No, it is.
I think there's so many people who just shut down the podcast.
Well, no, I don't think so because you're fundamentally right there. You just can't argue with musical skill. That's where it's all coming from, and that's the one thing that is never negotiable. That's the foundation of where every success comes from. Good. Yep. Look, maybe the very last question of today's session is, look, let's say, you speak for Pro Tools a lot. So if I'm a Pro Tools user and I'm a musician, so maybe there are things that I don't fully understand. It's misbehaving in a sense that I can't wrap my head around. Can you recommend maybe a YouTube channel or so, a specific place where I could, find knowledge that you would recommend?
Well, unfortunately, this is going to sound like shameless self-promotion. I apologize.
Go for it.
So there's a team of folks that I do a weekly show with, and you probably know this, Jan, called Pro Tools Answers. And it's two other AVID certified instructors, just like Jan is, by the way. And we just sit there and we take a look at people's questions that are posted to YouTube and just sometimes whatever we want to talk about. And we just sit there for a half an hour and we dig deep onto it and we just dig deep into it. That's all it is, right? It's geek talk. That's one way to do it, right? I would say that YouTube University is a school with many false classrooms. There's a lot of channels you can get into where what you learn will be wrong. Mm-hmm. So because somebody's created a video does not mean it's right. So choose your sources very carefully. I'm not going to drop the name, but there was a person who is an AVID sponsored artist who on his website said, never touch the master fader. That's completely wrong. It's just factually incorrect in every way that it can be incorrect. Yes. And it just drove me crazy that people are going to listen to that and follow it. And I'm like, that's just absolutely, it's so depressing. So what we did over at Pro Tools Answers, we showed why it was wrong. Demonstrations about how a master fader in a digital environment is different than what we used to have in the analog world. And we showed that. And so I think that Pro Tools Answers is a reliable source of information. Pensado's place is also a reliable place for information. I think that's great. I think that Pro Tools Expert is a good site on a good day and an average site on a bad day. I think there's a lot of promotion for different products going out, and sometimes it just seems like a lot of opinion that there's nothing wrong with it. It's to me, and I'm speaking out of school, but you asked the question. It's less valuable to me on the overall media landscape than it used to be, let's say 10 years ago. And finally, if you want to matriculate, if you want to actually formally study under a teacher, there's a lot of schools worldwide that have audio programs. Some of them are even AVID certified schools that will let you offer certification. If you go on to avid.com, you can actually buy my 101 book, which I think is not too bad. But there's places to go. The problem is There's so much information out there that is incomplete, misleading, or wrong that you have to be discerning about where you go, and you always have to be skeptical about what you believe.
Well said.
This podcast, check me on everything I've said. Everything. I'm confident that I'm right?
Yeah.
Could I be wrong? Absolutely. And I need to say that. I need to admit it. I need to understand that about myself. But don't disbelieve everything you hear, but certainly don't believe everything you hear. Verify it, make sure that you understand what's being said, make sure that it's right. And if it's not right, if somebody is spilling out, balderdash, don't go back. Don't go back to that place.
Well said. Well said. Andy, thank you so much for all the wisdom you shared with us today. It's really inspirational chatting to you, and I really appreciate how you broke down all the technical jargon and digestible chunks that actually make sense. So,
well, thank you. Thank you for letting me rant on.
Oh, I love it. I could keep going forever, but I think it's time to call it a day. I know that your time is very valuable, so I really appreciate this from the bottom of my heart, Andy. Thank you so much.
No, Jan, we're old friends. I'm happy to do it. And if you ever want to do it again, just let me know.
Cool. That sounds great. I might pick you up on that. Thank you, Andy.
Do it.
This was Mr. Andy Hagerman on the Production Talk podcast. What an interview. I've known Andy for many, many years, and it's so good to hang out again and have a chat to you, Andy. And thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom and your knowledge with us. Your ability to explain difficult things in simple terms is outstanding. So I think this is really amazing. Andy's books are available on the AVID website. So if you want to read the Pro Tools 101 book, that's definitely a good one. You can find it there. And I really recommend Andy's Pro Tools Answers videos on YouTube, and they're also on social media. Of course, the links are all in the show notes. So stop by at the end of the episode. Also, please rate this podcast episode, subscribe, leave a review if you want to. That would be absolutely amazing. Of course, I'm here for you if you ever need any help with your music production, especially if you're stuck with your projects and need a bit of help and a push to get a project to the finish line. That's when I would love a little message from you. The easiest way to find me is on my website, mixartist.com.au, where I offer mixed-on services to anybody who needs a little bit of help. Okay, thank you so much for tuning into the Production Talk podcast today. Please subscribe, please recommend this episode to all your friends, and I'll speak to you next time. Bye for now.